Why do you always smile when you see me, human? She asked. Because I want you to be my queen, I said. The shuttle shuddered as it passed through the station's atmospheric barrier, and Nathan Cole gripped his armrest with the quiet dignity of a man determined not to vomit on his first day as Earth's representative to the Celestial Accord. 14 hours in transit, 2 hyperspace jumps, and a meal that the ship's computer had optimistically labeled chicken had left him feeling less like a diplomat and more like laundry that had been through an aggressive cycle. Ambassador Cole, we are now docking at Base 17, the pilot announced with the enthusiasm of someone reading ingredients off a cereal box. Welcome to Celestial Accord Station. Current temperature is 22 degrees standard. Gravity is set to 0.9 Earth normal. Please watch your step as the Talaxian delegation has once again shed scales near the exit ramp. Nathan released his grip on the armrest and noticed his knuckles had gone white. 42 years old, 18 years in the diplomatic corps, and he still hated space travel with the passion most people reserve for tax audits. He stood, straightened his formal jacket, and caught his reflection in the polished viewport. Gray had begun colonizing his temples with alarming efficiency over the past year. His eyes looked tired in a way that sleep never quite fixed anymore. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months ago, but his face apparently hadn't received that memo. The docking bay opened into a corridor that made Nathan stop mid-step. He had seen photographs during his briefings, watched holographic tours until his eyes ached, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of the Celestial Accord Station. The walls curved upward in sweeping arcs of pale metal that seemed to breathe with embedded lights, pulsing in soft rhythms like a mechanical heartbeat. The air carried scents he couldn't identify. Something floral, something mineral, something that reminded him inexplicably of thunderstorms on summer evenings. Species he recognized only from training files moved past him in rivers of color and sound. A towering figure with skin like burnished copper nodded in his direction. Something small and furred scurried between legs, chittering in a language his translator implant rendered as, "Excuse me, pardon, terribly sorry, coming through." "Ambassador Cole?" A voice squeaked from somewhere around his elbow. Nathan looked down to find a being roughly 4 feet tall, covered in iridescent scales that shifted from green to gold depending on the light. The creature's enormous eyes blinked up at him with an expression of profound anxiety. "I am Vorn, your assistant. I am assigned to help you not die." Nathan blinked. "I'm sorry, did you say—" "Not die," Vorn repeated earnestly. "It is very easy for humans to die here. You eat the wrong flower, you die. You touch the wrong mineral, you die. You insult the wrong delegate, you die but more slowly and with paperwork." The Talaxian's scales flickered nervously. "I have prepared a list. It is quite long. I am sorry." "That's very thorough of you, Vorn." "I have had 4 human ambassadors," Vorn said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am determined that you will be the first one I do not lose." Nathan decided not to ask about the other 3. Some knowledge felt like a burden best avoided before lunch. His quarters were modest by diplomatic standards but possessed a viewport that stopped his breath. Valara Prime hung in the darkness below, swirled in clouds of amber and rose, its rings catching starlight like frozen rivers. Beyond it, a nebula sprawled across the void in colors that human languages had never needed to name. Deep purples bleeding into golds, streaked with veins of light that pulsed with the birth of distant stars. He pressed his palm against the cool glass and let himself feel small. This was why he had requested this posting. Not for advancement, not for glory, but for distance. For the chance to stand somewhere his memories couldn't follow, to fill his eyes with something that had nothing to do with the apartment he'd shared with Sarah. The coffee shop where they'd had their first date, the lawyer's office where they'd sat on opposite sides of a table and divided 18 years into boxes and signatures. The first council session was scheduled for the following morning, and Nathan spent his evening studying briefing files until his eyes burned. Trade agreements, resource allocation, the delicate politics of 17 species trying to share a galaxy without destroying each other. His translator implant would handle language, but diplomacy required something no technology could provide: the ability to read the spaces between words, to hear what remained unspoken. He fell asleep in his chair and dreamed of nothing. which was a mercy. The council chamber was a cathedral of light and silence. Tiered seating rose in concentric circles around a central platform, and delegates filled the rows in clusters of allegiance and convenience. Nathan found his designated seat among the human contingent and tried to look like he belonged there. Vorn sat beside him, scales cycling through anxious colors. "She is coming," Vorn whispered, and the chamber fell silent. Nathan felt her presence before he saw her. A cold stillness settled over the room, conversations dying mid-syllable, bodies shifting unconsciously toward attention. Then the doors parted, and Archduchess Siren entered like winter given form. 3 months on the Celestial Accord Station had taught Nathan Cole several valuable lessons. First, the coffee substitute available in the human quarter tasted like someone had boiled engine parts in despair. Second, diplomatic negotiations moved at approximately the same speed as continental drift, but with more passive-aggressive footnotes. Third, and most puzzling to him, he had somehow not died yet, which Vorn seemed to regard as a personal triumph of unprecedented magnitude. 87 days, Vorn announced proudly, his scales shimmering with satisfaction as they walked toward the council chamber. "This is the longest I have kept a human ambassador alive. My previous record was 53 days, and that one does not fully count because Ambassador Harrison technically survived. He simply refused to leave his quarters for the remaining 4 months of his posting." Nathan sipped his terrible coffee and grimaced. What happened to Ambassador Harrison? He ate a decorative flower at a reception. It was not poisonous, but it contained a compound that caused him to speak only in rhyming couplets for 6 weeks. Vorn's enormous eyes blinked up at Nathan with genuine sympathy. The Valaran delegates thought he was mocking their poetry traditions. It became an incident. A rhyming incident. We do not speak of it. The council sessions had developed a rhythm that Nathan found almost meditative in their predictability. Delegates argued about mining rights with the fervor of theologians debating sacred texts. Trade agreements were dissected, amended, rejected, and resurrected in cycles that seemed designed to ensure no actual progress occurred. Nathan had learned to find the patterns beneath the chaos. Which species held old grudges, which alliances were genuine, which smiles concealed calculations sharp enough to draw blood. He had also learned that Archduchess Siren entered every session at precisely the same moment, walked the same path to her elevated seat, and surveyed the chamber with eyes that missed nothing. Her platinum skin caught the ambient light like metal polished to perfection. Her long, elegantly pointed ears swept back against hair so pale it seemed woven from starlight itself. She never smiled. She rarely spoke except when necessary. When she did speak, delegates listened with the attentive silence of prey animals who had just noticed a predator. In every session without fail, Nathan smiled at her. It had started as an accident, really. That first day, exhausted and emotionally hollow, he had looked up as she entered and felt something unexpected. Not fear, not calculation, but simple appreciation for something striking. The smile had escaped before his diplomatic training could intervene. She had not acknowledged it. He had not expected her to, but somehow the habit had taken root. Now it had become a quiet ritual. She would enter, his eyes would find her, and he would smile. Not the careful smile he deployed in negotiations, not the practiced expression of diplomatic warmth. Something genuine, something that asked for nothing in return. He had noticed in recent weeks that her gaze now swept toward the human delegation section when she entered, a fraction of a second, barely perceptible. But Nathan had spent 2 decades reading the language of glances, and he knew the difference between coincidence and pattern. "You are doing it again," Vorn whispered urgently, scales flickering with alarm. "Doing what?" Smiling at her. At the Archduchess. Vorn's voice dropped so low that Nathan had to strain to hear it. "Ambassador, I must tell you something. There was a delegate 3 years ago who spoke to her without being addressed first. He complimented her ceremonial dress. He said it was lovely." Nathan waited. "And?" "He was reassigned to a monitoring outpost on a moon so remote that supply ships visit once per standard year. He sends messages sometimes. They are mostly about ice." "Vorn, I'm just smiling. It's a human greeting behavior. Humans greet everyone by exposing their teeth." Generally, yes. Vorn considered this with visible horror. Your species is deeply unsettling, Ambassador. The session that day concerned agricultural quotas, a topic so monumentally dull that Nathan found himself studying the chamber's architecture to stay awake. The ceiling arched overhead in geometric patterns that shifted subtly with the light, and he wondered what mathematical principles governed their design, what alien aesthetic sensibilities found beauty in those precise angles. His attention drifted to Siren. She sat motionless in her elevated seat, absorbing the droning testimony of a trade minister with no visible reaction. Her stillness itself was remarkable, not the restless patience of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the absolute composure of someone who had learned long ago that revealing nothing was its own form of power. 17 years, the briefing files had said. She had ruled her people for 17 years, since the civil war that had nearly destroyed them. Her brother had led the opposition faction. She had executed him herself when the war ended. The files had not elaborated on what that must have cost her. Nathan wondered if anyone ever looked at her and saw something other than power. If anyone had ever asked how she was feeling without an ulterior motive lurking beneath the question. The session concluded with no agreements reached, and 12 new subcommittees formed to study the matter further. Nathan gathered his materials and stood, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from 2 hours of enforced stillness. Ambassador Cole, Petra Vasquez, materialized at his elbow, her engineering jumpsuit stained with something iridescent. You owe me a drink. I just saved your life. Did you? The atmospheric processor in the human quarter was cycling in trace amounts of a compound that would have given you increasingly vivid hallucinations over approximately 6 weeks. You would have eventually become convinced that the walls were speaking to you. They were not going to say nice things. Nathan stared at her. That seems like critical information. Fixed it this morning, hence the drink. Petra grinned, the expression carving deep lines around her eyes. Also, I need someone to lose to at cards tonight. My usual opponents have learned to fear me. The private quarters of Archduchess Siren occupied the station's highest level, a suite of rooms designed to project power through emptiness. Vast windows curved outward into the void, offering an unobstructed view of Valara Prime's slow rotation below. The furniture was minimal, angular, chosen for aesthetics rather than comfort. No personal items softened the space. No photographs or mementos suggested a life beyond duty. She had lived this way for 17 years, and most days she no longer noticed the silence. Tonight, the silence felt heavier than usual. Siren stood before the viewport, her reflection ghosting against the stars. Her platinum skin caught the distant light of the nebula, painting faint colors across her cheekbones. She had dismissed her attendants hours ago, preferring solitude to the careful deference that surrounded her like a second atmosphere. They feared her, of course. Everyone feared her. Fear was efficient. Fear kept the peace her people had purchased with so much blood. She pressed her fingertips against the cool glass and watched a transport vessel drift toward the docking rings, its running lights blinking in patient rhythm. Somewhere on that vessel, beings were traveling toward meetings, reunions, farewells, lives moving forward in patterns she could observe but never quite touch. Her thoughts drifted, as they had with irritating frequency lately, to the human ambassador. Nathan Cole. The name sat strangely in her mind, too simple for the puzzle it represented. She had accessed his file weeks ago, telling herself it was routine security diligence. Earth origin, unremarkable family lineage, 18 years of diplomatic service marked by competence rather than brilliance. A dissolved marriage, recent enough that the bureaucratic documentation still carried fresh timestamps. Nothing in those dry facts explained why his smile had begun to occupy her thoughts like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. She had been smiled at before, certainly. Courtiers smiled with careful calculation, measuring how much warmth to deploy and what it might purchase. Rivals smiled with teeth hidden behind pleasant expressions. Sycophants smiled with desperate hope, seeking favor, advancement, survival. She had learned to read smiles the way military commanders read terrain, assessing threats, identifying weaknesses, planning responses. The human smile fit none of these categories. It asked for nothing. It expected nothing. It simply existed, appearing the moment his eyes found her, as consistent as stellar rotation. This bothered her more than she cared to admit. Siren moved to her personal console and called up the council session recordings from the past 3 months. She told herself she was reviewing for security purposes, analyzing delegation behaviors, identifying potential threats. The lie was comfortable enough that she almost believed it. She watched the human, the way he helped a struggling Talaxian delegate gather documents that had scattered across the floor. The way he diffused a tense exchange between trading partners with some self-deprecating comment that made both parties laugh despite themselves. The way his attention sharpened when others spoke, genuinely listening rather than merely waiting for his turn. And that smile, always that smile, finding her across the crowded chamber like a beacon signal cutting through interference. The door chimed, interrupting her study. Siren closed the recordings with a gesture and composed her expression into its familiar mask. Enter. Her protocol officer, a fastidious man named Kalen, stepped inside with a tablet clutched against his chest. His pale eyes avoided direct contact with hers, a habit she had long stopped trying to correct. Archduchess, I apologize for the intrusion. However, the Council of Lineages has again requested that you review potential consort candidates. They grow insistent that the succession question be addressed. Siren felt exhaustion settle into her bones. Show me. Kalen activated the tablet, projecting holographic profiles into the air between them. A nobleman with impressive military credentials and a smile that looked rehearsed. A trade magnate whose family controlled significant mineral wealth and whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who saw people as assets. A diplomat from a minor house, young and nervous, clearly selected for malleability. Duke Verantis comes highly recommended, Kalen offered carefully. His family's loyalty during the Civil War was unwavering. His family's loyalty was purchased with 3 mining contracts and a trade monopoly. Next, Lord the Sand has expressed particular interest. Lord the Sand expresses particular interest in anyone with power he can access. His previous 2 marriages ended in financial scandal. Next, perhaps the younger candidate, Envoy Miran, he is afraid of me. Siren watched the nervous holographic face rotate slowly. He should be. Any of them should be. But I have no interest in spending my remaining years with someone who flinches when I enter a room. Kalen hesitated, then deactivated the display. Archduchess, may I speak candidly? You may try. You have rejected 47 candidates over the past 4 years. The council grows concerned that your standards may be unattainable. Siren turned back to the viewport, watching starlight paint patterns on the void. 47 candidates, each one bringing political advantages, strategic alliances, the practical machinery of power that kept civilizations functioning. 47 candidates, and not one of them had ever looked at her as though she were something other than a position to be occupied. Tell the council I will consider their concerns. Shall I schedule presentations for the most promising? That will be all, Kalen. He departed with visible relief, leaving her alone with the stars and the silence. Siren found herself pulling up the council recordings again, scrolling to a moment 2 weeks ago when the human had made some observation that caused half the chamber to laugh. She watched his face, the easy warmth in his expression, and wondered what it would feel like to be smiled at like that every day. The thought startled her. She closed the recording and stood very still, confronting an unfamiliar feeling that had taken root in her chest like a vine growing in darkness. She had built her life on control, on certainty, on never allowing herself to want things that might weaken her position. But something about Nathan Cole's smile had slipped past her defenses, and for the first time in 17 years, Archduchess Siren found herself genuinely afraid. The alarms began at precisely 0347 station time, tearing Nathan from a dreamless sleep with the subtlety of a gravitational collapse. Red emergency lighting flooded his quarters, painting shadows across the walls in shades of warning. His translator implant crackled with automated announcements cycling through 17 languages, each one delivering the same message with varying degrees of linguistic panic. Security breach in sectors 7 through 12. All personnel proceed to designated shelter zones. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Nathan pulled on clothes without conscious thought, muscle memory from too many emergency briefings guiding his hands while his mind struggled to catch up with his body. The corridor outside his quarters had transformed into a river of frightened bodies, delegates and staff members flowing towards shelter points with the desperate efficiency of prey animals sensing predators. Vorn appeared at his elbow, scales flashing through colors Nathan had never seen before. Deep crimsons bleeding into blacks, the Talaxian equivalent of absolute terror. Ambassador, we must move quickly. A faction calling themselves the Purified Dawn has taken control of the station's secondary reactor systems. They are threatening to destabilize the containment fields unless their demands are met. What demands? They want all human delegates expelled from the station permanently. They believe your species is corrupting the natural order of galactic civilization. Vorn's enormous eyes blinked rapidly. I am told their manifesto is quite lengthy. There are footnotes. They move with the crowd, but somewhere between junction points, the flow of bodies diverged, emergency doors sliding shut as the station systems attempted to contain the threat. Nathan found himself pushed down an unfamiliar corridor, separated from the main group. Vorn's distressed chittering fading behind a sealed bulkhead. The corridor dead-ended at an observation alcove, a small space lined with viewports that looked out onto the nebula's swirling colors. Emergency lighting cast everything in crimson hues, and for a moment Nathan stood alone, catching his breath, trying to orient himself in the station's labyrinthine geography. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find he was not alone. 3 other beings had been caught by the same sealed doors. A Talaxian merchant whose scales had gone pale with fear, a towering Bravari delegate who kept muttering prayers in a language Nathan's implant couldn't parse, and Archduchess Siren. She stood apart from the others, her platinum skin catching the red emergency lights like metal heated in a forge. Her silver eyes assessed the situation with cold precision, showing no visible fear. Her long, pointed ears were angled slightly forward, listening to sounds beyond human perception. The bulkhead seals are magnetically reinforced, she said, her voice cutting through the ambient alarm noise. We will not breach them without tools. The Bravari delegate made a sound that might have been a whimper. We are trapped. The terrorists will find us. We will die in this corridor, and no one will know. We will not die in this corridor. Siren's tone carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by reality itself. The station's security protocols will resolve this situation. Our task is simply to wait. How can you be certain? The merchant asked, scales flickering with desperate hope. Because I have seen 17 years of crises, and I am still here. She paused, something almost like dry humor entering her voice. The universe has tried to kill me many times. It has consistently failed. Nathan found himself smiling despite the circumstances. Siren's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment something passed between them. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that fear was a choice, and they had both chosen differently. The hours that followed carved themselves into Nathan's memory with uncomfortable clarity. The emergency lighting cycled through patterns that made his eyes ache. The Bravari delegate eventually exhausted himself with worry and fell into fitful sleep against the wall. The Talaxian merchant produced a deck of cards from somewhere and taught Nathan a game that seemed to involve lying, complex mathematics, and occasional threats of violence. You are remarkably calm for someone whose species was specifically targeted, Siren observed, settling into a position that managed to look dignified despite the floor. Panic takes energy I'd rather conserve. Nathan accepted another card from the merchant and studied it without comprehension. Besides, if terrorists wanted to kill me specifically, they'd have chosen a more efficient method than threatening reactor containment. You have experience with assassination attempts? I have experience with budget meetings in the Earth Colonial Administration. After that, everything else feels manageable. The faintest hint of amusement crossed Siren's features before diplomatic composure reasserted itself. She watched him play cards with the merchant, losing consistently but with good humor that seemed to genuinely puzzle her. You do not become frustrated when you lose, she observed. I'm learning. Learning requires losing first. He glanced at her, that familiar warmth in his expression. Besides, winning isn't really the point. The point is that we're not sitting here terrified. We're doing something human, well, something sentient, passing time together instead of alone. Siren considered this. My advisors would never understand such reasoning. Your advisors probably haven't been trapped in a corridor during a terrorist incident. You would be surprised. The crisis ended 12 hours after it began. Security forces neutralized the Purified Dawn faction with minimal casualties. The bulkhead seals released with a pneumatic hiss, and station personnel flooded in with medical scanners and relief on their faces. Nathan stood, stretching muscles that had cramped from hours on the cold floor. When he turned, Siren was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Ambassador Cole, Archduchess, your conduct during this incident was noted. She paused as though searching for words that diplomatic training hadn't provided. You kept the others calm. You kept yourself calm. That is not nothing. Before he could respond, her attendants surrounded her, whisking her away toward medical evaluation and security debriefings. But just before she disappeared around the corner, she glanced back. Their eyes met across the crowded corridor, and Nathan smiled. This time, almost imperceptibly, she smiled back. The resource allocation session had lasted 7 hours, and Siren felt the weight of every minute pressing against her temples like a vice crafted from bureaucratic tedium. 14 delegations had presented competing claims to a mineral-rich asteroid belt. Each presentation had included historical justifications, stretching back centuries, economic projections filled with optimistic assumptions, and thinly veiled threats disguised as diplomatic courtesy. She had listened to all of it, arbitrated 3 near conflicts, and delivered a provisional ruling that satisfied no one completely, which meant it was probably fair. Now the chamber had emptied, delegates scattering to compose complaints and plan appeals, and Siren found herself walking without clear destination. Her attendants had learned long ago to recognize these moods, falling back to a respectful distance that allowed the illusion of solitude. Her feet carried her through corridors she rarely visited, away from the political heart of the station toward its quieter margins. The observation corridor on Deck 17 offered the station's most unobstructed view of the nebula. Floor-to-ceiling viewports curved outward into the void, and the lighting had been designed to dim automatically, allowing the cosmic display beyond to dominate. Few delegates came here. The location was inconvenient, far from the power centers where important people gathered to be seen. Siren had discovered it during her first year on the station and had never shared its location with anyone. She was not surprised somehow to find Nathan Cole already there. He stood with his back to her, silhouetted against the swirling colors of stellar birth. His posture suggested someone lost in thought, shoulders slightly bowed, hands clasped behind his back. He did not turn as she approached, but something in his stillness shifted, an awareness of her presence that required no confirmation. The view is better from the eastern viewport, he said quietly. The angle catches the light differently. More purple, less gold. You presume to advise me on aesthetics, Ambassador? He turned then, and there it was, that smile appearing as naturally as breathing. I presume to share an observation. You can do with it whatever you like. Siren moved to stand beside him, maintaining proper diplomatic distance while something inside her wished she wouldn't. The nebula stretched before them in impossible colors, clouds of gas and dust illuminated by the birth fires of infant stars. She had seen this view countless times, but tonight it felt different, more present, more real. I have a question, she said, surprising herself with the words. Of course, Archduchess. Her silver eyes studied him with clinical precision, searching for the calculation that surely lurked beneath his pleasant expression. She found nothing but patient attention, genuine interest, that peculiar openness that defied everything she knew about political creatures. Why do you always smile when you see me, human? The question emerged more directly than she had intended, stripped of diplomatic cushioning. Others cower when I enter a room. Others calculate how to use my presence for their advantage. You simply smile. Every time, without fail. I have observed this for 14 months, and I cannot determine your purpose. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the nebula. She watched his profile, the thoughtful furrow of his brow, the way he seemed to be having a conversation with himself before responding. The honest answer or the diplomatic answer? I have heard enough diplomatic answers to last several lifetimes. Fair enough. He took a breath, and something shifted in his expression. A decision made, a bridge crossed. Because I want you to be my queen. Siren went absolutely still. The words hung in the recycled air between them, impossible and absurd, and somehow exactly what she had not known she was waiting to hear. Her mind, trained by 17 years of political survival, immediately began searching for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda that must exist beneath such a declaration. She found nothing, just a human standing in starlight, watching her with quiet certainty. That is an unusual ambition, she managed finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Most who seek power wish to stand beside me, not beneath me. I don't want power. His smile remained, but something deeper had surfaced in his eyes, something vulnerable and fierce all at once. I just want you, and you deserve to be treated like a queen by someone who actually means it. You know nothing about me. I know you eat alone. I know you dismiss your attendants when you need space to think. I know you watch the younger delegates with something that looks like wistfulness when you think no one is observing. He turned to face her fully. I know that everyone around you wants something from you, and I know how exhausting that must be. I don't want your position or your influence or your political connections. I just want to see you smile. Genuinely smile. I suspect it's been a long time since anyone wanted only that. Siren felt heat rising to her cheeks, a silver flush she couldn't control. 17 years of ruling through fear and respect, and no one had ever looked at her the way this human did. Not as a throne to be won, but as a person to be seen. You are either very brave or very foolish, Ambassador Cole. Probably both. His smile widened, self-deprecating and warm. Is that a problem? She should dismiss him. She should retreat behind protocol, deliver some cutting remark that would remind him of his place. She should protect herself the way she had always protected herself, with distance and ice in the armor of authority. Instead, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Siren smiled back. The weeks following their conversation in the observation corridor moved with a strange new rhythm, like a familiar song transposed into an unexpected key. Siren found reasons to consult with the human delegation about trade provisions that required no consultation. Nathan discovered urgent diplomatic questions that could only be addressed in private meetings with the Archduchess herself. Neither of them acknowledged what they were doing, but both understood perfectly. Vorn noticed first, because Vorn noticed everything that might potentially result in his ambassador's death. You have met privately with the Archduchess 6 times in 14 days, he observed, scales flickering with complex anxiety. This is unprecedented. The previous record was 2 meetings in 1 month, and that ambassador was negotiating a planetary surrender. We're discussing cultural exchange initiatives. For 11 hours total? It's a complex culture. Vorn's enormous eyes blinked slowly, processing information that clearly troubled him. Ambassador, I must ask, are you attempting to court the Archduchess of the Valaran Empire? Nathan considered several diplomatic deflections before settling on honesty. I believe she's courting me, actually. I'm just trying to keep up. The Talaxian made a sound that his translator implant rendered as untranslatable distress and excused himself to update his emergency protocols. Petra Vasquez took the news with considerably more enthusiasm, nearly choking on her drink when Nathan mentioned it during their weekly card game. You absolute madman, she laughed, wiping synthetic whiskey from her chin. You're telling me that while the rest of us have been tiptoeing around that woman like she's a live reactor core, you've been making eyes at her? I smiled at her, repeatedly. That's the most aggressively human thing I've ever heard. Petra dealt another hand, grinning broadly. So what's the plan? You going to propose? Move to her homeworld? Learn to enjoy whatever terrifying cuisine her people eat? I don't know yet. Nathan studied his cards without seeing them. I just know that when I'm with her, I don't feel like I'm performing diplomacy. I feel like I'm actually talking to someone. Petra's expression softened slightly. You know, after Maria left, I thought I'd never want to try again. Easier to just focus on engines and gambling debts. But watching you stumble into whatever this is, it makes me think maybe I was wrong to give up so quickly. That might be the most emotionally vulnerable thing you've ever said to me. Don't get used to it. Now, are you going to bet or just stare at those cards like they contain the secrets of the universe? The formal reception marking the end of the quarterly council session provided an opportunity neither of them had explicitly planned, but both had anticipated. Delegates mingled in the grand hall, a soaring space designed to make every species feel slightly inadequate. Music drifted from sources Nathan couldn't identify, melodies that shifted to accommodate different auditory preferences depending on where you stood. He saw Siren enter, resplendent in ceremonial attire that caught the light like captured starfire. Their eyes met across the crowded room and he smiled. She did not smile back, not yet, but something in her posture changed. A softening so subtle that only someone who had spent months studying her would notice. She moved through the crowd, accepting greetings and delivering precise acknowledgments, following the choreography of power that such events demanded. Nathan watched her work, admiring the competence, understanding the exhaustion it must conceal. Then she was standing before him, and the noise of the reception seemed to fade into background static. Ambassador Cole, I require your perspective on a diplomatic matter. Of course, Archduchess. Dance with me. It was not a request. Nathan inclined his head and offered his hand, acutely aware of every eye in the room, suddenly finding them fascinating. Siren's fingers closed around his, cool and steady, and they moved together onto the floor designated for such displays. People are staring, he observed quietly. People always stare. Tonight they will have something worthwhile to observe. They danced in silence for several measures, learning each other's rhythms. Her long ears caught the light as she moved, and up close Nathan could see the faint silver flush coloring her platinum cheeks. I have been considering your proposal, she said finally. I wasn't aware I had proposed anything specific. You proposed treating me as a queen. I have decided to allow it, she paused, something vulnerable flickering across her features. My delegation departs for Valera Prime in 3 days. Extended negotiations regarding the trade agreements require continued discussion. I am formally requesting that you accompany us. Nathan's heart performed a maneuver that probably violated several laws of physics. As a diplomatic representative? As whatever you wish to be. Her silver eyes held his, and for the first time he saw hope there, fragile and fierce, like a flame that had nearly forgotten how to burn. I have spent 17 years ruling alone. I find I am tired of solitude. I find that your smile has become something I look for. I find that this terrifies me, and I am choosing to be terrified. That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I am not skilled at romance. You're doing fine. He pulled her slightly closer. Protocol be damned. I'll come to Valera Prime. I'll come anywhere you ask. The reception continued around them, but they had ceased to notice. Tomorrow there would be politics, complications, 17 years of precedent to navigate. Tonight there was only this. Two people who had found each other across impossible distances, choosing to try. As the music shifted and the nebula painted colors across the viewport behind them, Siren smiled. Not the controlled expression of diplomatic necessity, but something true and unguarded, transforming her features into something Nathan knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve. Why are you still smiling, human? Because my queen is smiling back, the end.